Yeah, so we're live. I still hear some background noise.
I don't know. Are we live now for everyone?
Yes.
Okay. Should I start then?
Yeah, just 1 minute.
It's a little. But if there's an AC or something, I think there's not much we can do now.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, yes, if everybody could, of course, mute themselves when they're not speaking, that would be great. If you forget it once, then that's not a problem. Yeah. So, I'm going to mute myself, and I think you can start.
Okay. Now I don't hear anything anymore, strangely. Hello?
I think there was a lot of studio noise, so I think at this point we can begin.
Okay, let's begin. Welcome, everyone. I'm very happy that we have the chance to speak today to 3 of the protagonists of the Asia Art Archive. We're speaking with John Tain, Chuong-Dai, and Anthony Jung, who are in Hong Kong and in Shanghai at the moment. I'm in Berlin. My name is Ariane Beyn. I'm an independent curator. There's a strange feedback. Do I have to, excuse me? Tom?
Yes. Yes. Hello?
I have one technical question. Now I'm hearing the YouTube sound as well. Do I have to switch it off?
Yes, you should mute it. On the
Just mute it.
lower corner of YouTube, you can just
Okay.
click the super.
Okay.
And if you can, for technical questions, just refer to me on WeChat.
Okay.
Because I'm not
sorry
supposed
for this.
to speak. All good.
Okay. Sorry for the interruption. I think we're now clear. This talk is part of the public program of the exhibition Readings from Below that's on at the Times Art Center Berlin until mid-December. Unfortunately, we are right now in a partial lockdown in Germany because of the corona situation, and the exhibition is closed at the moment. But if you want to find out more about the exhibition, you can also look at the online publication where the artist published more materials on the works in a very interesting way. So this talk is part of the public program called Why an Archive? And it's presented in collaboration with the Arsenal Institute for Film and Video Art. It consists of a film program and 3 talks. This is the 3rd talk of the 3 talks. The 2 other talks are already uploaded to the website of Archive Aaa. The film program was curated by me in close collaboration with 3 independent archives, Videotage, Video Bureau, and Asia Art Archive. And it is shown in the online cinema of the Cinema Arsenal 3, for the whole month of November. And it's also a part of the long-term project Archive außer sich. The exhibition Readings from Below is bringing together works that approach the present via the archive, or one could say works that are entangled in a relationship with the archive. In our public program, we wanted to shift perspectives towards actual archival work and collaborate with 3 of the most influential independently run archives from Beijing, Hong Kong, and Guangzhou, in order to learn more about their hybrid forms, their activities within and beyond the digital, their practices and ways to build community and to generate far-reaching networks of knowledge production and exchange. And I would like to introduce our three speakers now with short but very dense bios that already tell us a lot about what Asia Art Archive is doing. And I will read your bios in reverse alphabetical order, starting with Anthony. Anthony, now I have to see the YouTube image is on the lower left side of the YouTube image. Anthony Jung is researcher at Asia Art Archive, specializing in China-related research projects. From 2006 to 2010, he managed Materials of the Future, documenting contemporary Chinese art from 1980 to 1990, a research project that produced 100 interviews with artists, critics, scholars, and others, and collected a large amount of archival material related to Chinese contemporary art from the late 70s to the early 90s. He organized a series of interviews for Uncooperative Contemporaries, the latest volume in the magazine After All's Exhibition Histories series, and his exhibition Learning What Can't Be Taught, reflecting on changes in art education at the China Art Academy in Hangzhou, opens in December. Chuong-Dai, who is on the top right in the YouTube image, is researcher for Southeast Asia collections at Asia Art Archive. Her research and curatorial interests include the developments of modernisms and performance-based practices. In thinking through the construction of regional and global art histories, she also is looking at exchanges between Southeast Asia and Eastern Europe. Recent projects include the development of the Green Papaya and Manila Artist-Run Spaces research collections to launch on AAA's website later this year. In 2019, she curated Form Color Action, an exhibition of the artist Leewen's sketchbooks at AAA. And her forthcoming projects include curatorial collaborations with the Green Papaya Collective. John Tain, on the lower right side of the YouTube image, is head of research at AAA, where he works with a team based in Hong Kong, New Delhi, and Shanghai. He recently co-convened MAHASA, or MAHASSA, Modern Art Histories in and across Africa and South and Southeast Asia, a collaboration between the Dhaka Art Summit, Cornell University's Institute for Comparative Modernities, and Asia Art Archive. He is a series editor for After All's Exhibition Histories, which this summer published Uncooperative Contemporaries, looking at exhibitions in Shanghai in the year 2000. His exhibition, Crafting Communities, is on view at the Asia Art Archive until the end of this month. So before we start, before we enter the conversation, I think I should mention that through YouTube and the chat function, the audience can ask questions, and we take the questions probably after speaking about several aspects of the Asia Archive. So we decided to first speak about the founding history, the profile, and the structure of Asia Art Archive. Could you tell us first about the founding history and also the context of the founding of Asia Art Archive 20 years ago in Hong Kong, China?
First of all, thank you, Ariane, for inviting Asia Art Archive to participate in the YN Archive program that's connected with the exhibition Readings from Below. It's a fascinating sounding exhibition. And I'm sorry that we're not able to visit, but hopefully there are plenty of other people who are able to visit. It's interesting, I think, for Asia Art Archive to be involved in this corollary program connected with Readings from Below, because I think one of the things that's interesting about the exhibition is that it's working with artists who are thinking about archives and thinking about conceptions and histories of archives. And I think that's very much connected with Asia Art Archive's modus operandi. That is to say, when AAA, as we refer to it, was founded in 2000, it was very much because of a felt and perceived lack of resources for people who are interested in doing research in modern and contemporary Asia. And so one of its goals is to really address scholarly needs. for people who are doing research, who are doing scholarship on the history of contemporary Asia and also modern Asia. But one of the things that Asia Art Archive very quickly also made part of its brief or part of its mission is also working with artists to kind of really think about archives and the forms of archives and how archives in some ways can permeate or be extended within a kind of a larger, wider discourse. So I think that that's something that has always been part of its mission. And I think that that's partly to do with the fact that it's particularly focused on contemporary art as opposed to earlier periods of art. And so, because part of what it's doing is documenting the art of today, living art, I think part of its thinking was also informed by its conversations with living artists and their interest in this. So I think that this program is in some ways a very kind of a germane one for us to be doing at this moment on our 20th anniversary, when we're thinking about these histories and thinking about what we have been doing and what we are doing. So that gives you a sense of the kind of the larger philosophical point. And then as to more concrete details, so Asia Art Archive, as you mentioned, is primarily based in Hong Kong. When it was founded, its main office was in Hong Kong. And since then, we have now opened offices in Delhi and also in Shanghai. But this is where our library collection is. So one of the first things we did was we began collecting books, and so at this point we have over 50,000 volumes in our library, which is here housed on site. And we also have an online collection of archival resources, and so we call these research collections. At this point, we have now over 40 research collections that span all of Asia. So, well, from East Asia, so collections in China, in Vietnam, in the Philippines, in Thailand, in India, Pakistan. So, we're kind of working our way across Asia in terms of different collections. And I think also in terms of time span, I think some of the collections maybe began with the 80s onward, but now, we're also looking at histories that kind of reach further back into the 20th century. So that gives a sense of what we do. In addition to the collections, we have programs of grants that we give to artists and scholars for using the collections and also doing research that we feel aligns with our priorities and our interests. And also we occasionally do programs such as conferences and exhibitions, which you noted when introducing us. Each of us has done one or more exhibitions for AAA. And a lot of what we do, because we're a small organization, we do in collaboration with other organizations. And so this is something that, like the Mahasa program, which was done with Dhaka Art Summit and also Cornell's Institute for Comparative Modernities, or exhibitions that we've done in India with the Serendipity Art Foundation. We've working on projects with MoMA and other museums, and so this is something that that is also part of AA's DNA, the kind of collaborative aspect of it. But maybe at this point, I can ask Anthony to talk a little about the kind of his view on AA's history, because in some ways he's been here longer than either Chuong-Dai or I, so he might have interesting things to say about that.
Okay, thank you, John, for the introduction, and thank you, Ariane, for the invitation. So just a little bit of the history of AA, just like John has given a very good general introduction about the organization. So we started in year 2000 as a small organization, just a few people, a few bookshelves in Hong Kong. And but we were small, but we started with a very big ambition. So we were talking about contemporary art in the entire Asia, and this is of course a very big territory that we were talking about. Like John said, we started it with as a kind of response to the lack of similar efforts of archives and institutional documentation of the history of contemporary art in the region. So the first model of research that we use is that we have researchers around different cities in Asia. So we look for people who are active participants of the art scenes of different places, local people. So I remember that we had researchers in, for example, in Singapore, in Tokyo, Seoul, we have people in Delhi, Lahore, Beijing, etc. So we have people. Of course, we can't have people in all the major cities in the entire Asia, but we try to have as many as possible. And the reason for that is that we were young and we were trying to learn. So we have people to it's more like a correspondent. So we have people who know the scene, we talk to them, and we want them to keep an eye for us about possible interesting archival projects in these places. And we learned about these places. And of course, they also follow with the latest activities in these places. So this is the first model that we use. And like John said, in the beginning, we collect a lot of books. So we slowly built our library. So we started with, as a library, we have of course a big, one of the best libraries of contemporary Asian art now in the world. In the beginning, we start to collect things bit by bit. After a period of time, we started to think about the archives. So we started to think about what we call research collections. This is because in the process of us doing research, doing scoping and mapping, we talk to people, and people have expressed, especially artists and curators, they have expressed this need of doing a more comprehensive, systematic archives of themselves, so of the individuals. This is because there are no other similar institution who are doing this. So artists think that they wanted people to help them to do a systematic archive about themselves. And of course, this is a valuable thing to do. And one of the first archives that we worked with was this artist called Wu Sanjuan, who is from Zhejiang, from China, but he has also lived in Hamburg in Germany. So he is one of the most important conceptual artists from contemporary China. And we had a very good collaboration with him. And he decided to donate his archive to Aaa, which is very interesting because his practice is a lot about diagrams, sketches, and writings. So sometimes it's very hard to distinguish what either this is a piece of archival document or this is a piece of original artwork in this archive. So it's especially interesting for us because it's a chance for us to, think about this difference between the two entities. We came to a questions about how to represent this archive. After we get the archive, of course, we do everything we can to put them in the best preservation situation, and also we index them. But how do we represent it after we do the basic works? So we decided we make a book out of it. So this is one of the few books that Asia Archive have made. It's called Wet Humor International by Wu Sanjuan. And it's a very good book, I think. It's very influential in terms of the study of this artist. And of course, I think it's one of the good ways to represent an archive, but it's also very, very time consuming. It's very costly. Of course, it's very useful in another way. So it was one of our earliest exercise of handling a research collection. And we started more and more. So of course, we come to this question immediately, which is what to collect. because there's so many people, so many interesting topics, so many valuable research directions. So how do we decide? I think actually we started a lot with China. And I think this is because we had, of course, geographical proximity to mainland China. We were based in Hong Kong. And some of the founders of the organization are actually experts of contemporary art in China themselves. So like Jane Debevoise, who is still our chairman. Claire Xu is our executive director. She is also a researcher of contemporary Chinese art. And also Johnson Chan, of course, is a famous gallerist and curator of contemporary Chinese art. So we started with a very good collection of books of contemporary Chinese art, and we had a very good network in the first place. So in about year 2006, 2005, I think, so 5 years after the organization was established, we came to this idea of doing a research project dedicated to the 1980s in mainland China, contemporary art in 1980s in mainland China. And the project was called Materials of the Future. So if you log into the website, you can find a lot of information about that. And it was a large-scale research project, one of the largest that we have ever done. And it happened between roughly 2005 and 2010. And the most important component of the project was that we did interviews. Just like in my introduction, you said that I have managed this project and conduct a lot of interviews, like 100 interviews with people. So we talked to different people. We talked to a lot of people, and we thought that is one of the most efficient way to do the scoping. Of course, it's a big subject matter. We didn't attempt to collect everything and talk about everything, but we found some major issues in the project. For example, the question about readings. So we asked these people a lot about what they read in the 1980s.
Yeah, and maybe I can jump in to say that one of the reasons why oral histories is maybe a particularly effective method for gathering information at that moment in time is because there precisely wasn't sufficient or existing collections or archives to refer to. And so this was a kind of a very kind of a quick way to gather information and to make that available. And then starting from there to then think about other resources that might be there. You know, that's one way to kind of find out what the field is like, right? Sorry, Anthony.
Yeah, excuse me.
Yeah.
So we videotape all these interviews, and the videos are all part of the archive now, and you can log in and watch the videos and see the transcript. So it's a big collection of all history video in the archives. And of course, throughout the project, we also collect materials, primary materials from these people, from the artists, curators, critics, scholars that we talked to about the topic. And those were the first few research collections that AA has collected. So this is how it began. And I think quite quickly, we realized that we should move to digitization. So it's quite quickly that we had this realization. I can't remember exactly when we make this very clear decision that we want to digitize everything, but it seems to us quite clearly that it makes a lot of sense to do so, because when we work with China, people live in mainland China, and China is a big country. So we travel around to people live in Beijing, in Shanghai, in Hong Kong, in Guangzhou. And when they donate materials to us, we never thought that it makes a lot of sense that we want to bring everything back to Hong Kong and store them in Hong Kong. First of all, we actually don't have a lot of space in Hong Kong, and they have a lot of space in mainland China. So it's a paradox. The second thing is that, of course, digitization is a very good way for preservation, and it's a very good way for annotation and organization of the archives. And it makes even more sense when we develop archives of other regions. So as far as I remember, one of the earliest big archives, big research collections that we work on outside of China was the India one, is the archive of Gita Kapoor and Vivan Sundaram. And of course, it makes no sense that we want to bring everything from New Delhi back to Hong Kong to work. So we had a wonderful research team based in New Delhi. His name is Sabi and Sneha, our colleagues. So they slowly develop a lot of works in on-site in New Delhi, and now they have an office there too. I think
yeah.
I hope that I gave you a clear version of how we came to.
Yes, I mean, just to summarize this for the audience who doesn't know AAA so well, that decision means that you're not collecting original documents anymore right now, but you're practically digitizing or copying everything. And my question would be, does that also mean that you can deal with these materials in a completely different way, make them much more accessible, maybe than an archive that would deal with the original files would be able to? And also, does it change your perspective on what a document is? I mean, you've already mentioned that perspective has changed, what an archival document would be today.
I think this question is a question that we think about daily. So this is a question that we think about a lot, at least. I talked about the practical reason why we prefer digitization. But actually, people have asked us to help them to safeguard their archives. It's happened a lot. So people want to give us their physical archives because people still don't find a lot of reliable institutions within their regions. So it happened in mainland China, it also happened elsewhere in Southeast Asia. It's still not very easy for people to find, for example, a public museum or a university that they find safe and reliable, because economic and political situation change a lot in these places. So they prefer to. Sometimes people suggest that, okay, I'm going to give you my archive, and why don't you keep it in Hong Kong? So we have this problem. This is because we, like I said, we don't have enough space actually. And it's also it's mean a very different thing, that we have a dedication, we have a commitment to safeguard the physical archive. For us, at least for me, I can't talk on behalf of everyone. For me, of course, the most important thing is the information rather than the materiality of the archives. So, for example, when I do research, I seldom use the original. Even we have the original, we use the digital version. Even when I create a documentation exhibition, I try to use reproduction more, except when I want to add a little bit more sensibility to the show. So I guess sometimes it's a case-by-case situation. Some people, I met researchers who come to us and request particularly to look at the original material for the reasons that they have a different sensibility, the different sensational relationship with the historical document, something like that. But for me, personally speaking, and a few other colleagues that I've talked to, there's actually no harm to just look at the digital version.
I think that's also true for our collections that have to do with Southeast Asia. So Ariane, to your question about the original versus a digital, a lot of our collections in Southeast Asia, most of the material actually is born digital. Digital photographs, video. Of course, some of the older video that came in VHS, or Super 8 or something like that, we do digitize that, but the more recent material, for example, the Green Papaya collection that I'm working on right now, I mean, emails, a lot of video documentation, a lot of digital photos. But I also wanted to address your question and to build on what Anthony has been talking about, and to talk about it in relation to the Ray Langenbach archive, right? And so, one of the things that Anthony talked about is how a lot of people come to us, because their collections are in danger for some reason. It could be climate, it could be space. In Ray's case, actually the material, he could have lost it to the police. So he has a large collection of material on performance-based practices. And I'm using that phrase performance-based rather than performance art because he is interested in different forms of performance along a wide range, and that spans from what we understand as performance art in a Western European US sense, but also he's interested in street demonstrations, political protests, theater. And so he has recording of all of those different types of performance-based practices, and it spans about 20 years. A lot of it is from practices in Southeast Asia, but also there's a lot of footage and photographs of practices in Europe and in the US. In 2006, he had co-organized a performance art symposium in Kuala Lumpur. And one of the audience members had complained to the police about it. And so the police shut it down. And shortly after that, Ray got a message from his lawyer saying that the police would come to ask him questions, right? And so he was really worried about what that would mean. And so he packed up his archive and he took it to a friend's house. And luckily it was safeguarded there, right? And so eventually he was able to take his material out of KL. He approached us, I think the initial conversation was in the early 2000s, right? At that time, and Anthony, do correct me if I'm wrong, I think our staff was only 2 or 3 people. And so we didn't really have the manpower to take on such a large collection. We had to learn how to do it. So one of it was human resources, but the other thing was also to do a lot of research in terms of what kind of technology, things like hard drives and servers, IT, support, all of that. We had to do that kind of research in order to be able to bring his collection into AAA. And so then that process happened in 2014. And so that collection is really important, not only in terms of the documentation that it offers across Southeast Asia, but also it reminds us, that performance art itself, can be vulnerable to censorship and to other forms of, that would prevent us from knowing this history, right? And of course, within that archive there's very valuable footage of the Artists General Assembly, which was a week-long festival, and within that festival is the video Brother King, which is a part of this conversation that we're having.
Exactly. I think there's one really important aspect of what you're doing that's quite different from other archives, as far as I can tell, is that you're really also focused on performance art on the one hand, which is something that is very present, especially in Southeast Asia, and that a lot of your video files are documents of performances. In the conversation that we had with Videotage, there was a similar subject that in the early days of Hong Kong media art, a lot of the video works were also documentations of performance. And we speak about that maybe when we speak about object activities in a moment. Another side that I find really important about what AAA is doing is that you also decided that next to the collections, or let's say the estates of individual artists, you're focused on exhibitions and the history of exhibitions and festivals and so on. That is also something that is, I would say, rather new in the history of archives or art history in general. Could you maybe tell us a little bit about when that change happened at AAA, or was it something that you decided from the very beginning that an exhibition or the history of exhibitions would be in the focus as well?
Well, maybe I can kind of begin to answer that, which is, I think, you know, in addition to the reaching out to individuals, whether they're artists or curators or scholars in the field, one of the things that AA was doing at that kind of earlier phase that Anthony was referring to earlier was, you know, having these researchers in different cities. And the way that the researchers worked was that they literally were building Asia Art Archive, like literally at that point there was an Asia Art Archive, and all of these researchers were essentially sending documentation back, right? So their goal was to go out to see exhibitions and to take photographs and to document them, basically kind of be like journalists or, you know, bloggers, except there was no blog at that point. There were no, you know, blogs didn't exist at that point in time. But basically they were kind of live documenting events as they were happening. And so exhibitions and were always part of AA's, you know, kind of purview, what it was paying attention to. Because oftentimes the contemporary art is happening through these events, through exhibitions, and also in Asia through festivals. There was a great number of festivals that was coeval, being founded at about the same time that, you know, these biennial events that were, you know, that kind of experienced a resurgence in the 1990s, thanks to the rise of kind of exhibitions across Asia, you know. And so, you know, you have the Guangzhou Biennale, of course, but other biennales as well, you know. So Fukuoka was also a very important city. The Triennale in Australia, that, you know, Asia Pacific Triennial, that, you know, all of these events kind of helped establish a profile for contemporary art across Asia. And so one of the things that, you know, Asia Art Archive understood very early was that these exhibitions and these festivals were very important kind of points, you know, for gathering information, for documenting what was happening, and for kind of taking the pulse of what, you know, what was going on and how trends were happening. So that's kind of, you know, that was something that was always part of Asia Art Archive's interests. That said, I think that, you know, this also kind of, you know, went in hand with the other side, which is kind of thinking about individuals within that larger kind of field. And so, you know, I think someone like Zhang Pei Li, for instance, you know, who was a very important figure in the development of video as a medium in China, you know, was of course someone that, you know, Anthony and Jane wanted to speak to for Materials of the Future. And then I think out of that kind of conversation came the idea to collect his archive. And through his archive, you can then see, you know, the events that he participated in. And so there were exhibitions, there were conferences, there were, you know, other kind of things that took place. And so it was kind of like a feedback loop where we started off, you know, going into the field and gathering as much as we could, but then in the process developed a kind of a group of people who we felt were particularly kind of informative, you know, kind of in offering a perspective onto not just the present as it was happening, but also maybe the more recent past. And, you know, this maybe is something that Anthony can talk about in terms of, you know, Zhang Pei Li's archive, but also in the, you know, with regard to the piece that, you know, we selected for the program on Arsenal.
Anthony, do you want to speak about Zhang Pei Li? And maybe
Yeah,
I can quickly mention before you start that his works were recently shown in Berlin at an exhibition called Micro Area at the Kulturforum, actually several of his early works also, which were quite amazing to see here. I think a lot of Berliners have seen that exhibition.
So Zhang Peili is a very interesting case, very interesting artist, because he's generally considered to be one of the first artists, if not the first, to use video in contemporary Chinese art. So he was one of the first video artists. He made a piece called 30 times 30 in 1988. So actually video art appeared in mainland China quite late. It's only after the mid-80s because of the economic situation and general material condition of the country. So people got to have their own TV only maybe mid-80s or so. So it was a new technology to them, and he was very sensitive to this kind of new technology and technological method. So he made the video and continued to use video as a major medium of his art. And talking about him, I actually think of an interesting observation, which I want to share, is that in the early years, in the beginning, we actually did not collect a lot of video artwork. We did not collect the video per se. You know what I mean? Because at that time, it was people, artists, were still a little bit more conscious about sharing the full version of their video work. So people think about, okay, if I share my work to an archive, maybe it should be a shorter version, maybe it should be a low-res version, and things like this. So it was the thing is more complicated at that time in the early years. But in recent years, people are much more open about it. This is, of course, relevant to the culture of social media and also YouTube and things like that. Internet video platform. So people now, okay, artists is like, okay, I can just send you a link and you can download and you can put it on your website for everyone to see, no problem. So we see that there's a clear change of attitude, and also new technology has given us a lot of convenience in terms of storing and also sharing these videos. For a very long period of time, it was very hard to write about video art, because actually it was very hard for people to really access to the video pieces. I mean, in the context of China. So the only chances for people to see these video works is at the exhibition. But actually it's very difficult for people to watch the entirety of the video work in the setting of an exhibition, especially for artists like Zhang Peili. Zhang Peili is comparatively easier, but for artists like Yang Fudong, who has video works that are like feature films, it's very hard for people to stay in the exhibition and watch the film and also really think about it. So for a long period of time, it was very hard for people to really write very well about these video pieces. But I think the situation has changed, and I think it's an interesting thing.
Interestingly, this first Zhang Peili piece, the one from 1988, that's also almost a performance, isn't it? Or
yes.
Somewhere between
yes.
performance and video art.
You have that's a very good point. Actually, in the beginning, I think Chinese artists had they did not have very clear differentiation between documentation of performance and video art. Actually, the two definitions sometimes is not very clear, right? Even for any artist in the world. But in the beginning in China, there were actually artists who used video to document their performance earlier than Zhang Peili. And this is one thing that historians and critics have been discussing about why people would think that Zhang Peili's piece 30 by 30 is the first video piece. Many people argue that it's about, of course, his use of the camera. He's, of course, a lot more conscious about the framing, the use of the camera, and the materiality. And it's very interesting because the length of the video piece, 80x80, is the length of the videotape, of the tape. So he didn't stop. The piece was about he's breaking a piece of glass mirror and stick it back together again and break it and do it again. So it's a repetitive, endless, resultless effort. So it's about that. So I think in my interpretation, it doesn't supposed to be there's an end to it. And the only end that we have is the length of the videotape. So it's like 70 some minutes. So until the tape went out, the performance ended. So you see, it's very obvious that he was thinking about the medium and the dimensionality of the medium. That's why historians and critics will think that it's at least is a pioneer and a groundbreaking video work in contemporary China.
But I think one of the other things that, one of the other reasons for thinking about Zhang Peili as a kind of a pioneer of video art is because he then continues. I mean, I think it is definitely the case that, 30x30 started off being conceived as a performance. And I think it's one thing to kind of bear in mind is that, he originally intended for it to be performed at a kind of a conference setting. And it was meant to be kind of this absurd kind of endurance test for everyone in the conference where he was going to be, breaking this glass over and over again. And then finally, like he didn't want to be an actor. And so he decided to do it on video. And I think, Anthony, if I'm remembering correctly, the people in the conference actually they couldn't even stand like watching a few minutes. I think by like 2-3 minutes or something, they were like ready for it to be turned off. Like they're like, turn off the video, and don't want to watch it anymore. And so it was kind of like, yeah.
Yeah, it's a very funny story because for him, it's not only the piece, but also it's the situation. It's part of the work. You want to lock everyone in a conference about contemporary art in China. You want to lock everyone in the room and play these videos. Of course, it's very boring to watch the entirety of this. And critics and artists in China at that time were not so used to video work like this. They were not familiar with the format. They were not familiar with the language. So people were asking him, okay, fast forward, it's all the same, we get it, okay, don't watch it. So the plan that he had actually failed because he didn't manage to really have these people watch the entirety of this. They just watch a few minutes of it. But just it's a funny anecdote.
Yeah.
And could you maybe then speak about the piece that you selected for this program by Zhang Peili? And I have to say here that in the case of AAA, the selection was entirely made by the three of you and not by me for this film program. But I was extremely happy with your choice. That's why I have no comment on it. But maybe you could say more about this more recent piece of Zhang Peili.
Thank you very much. This work is, I think it's a very interesting one. It's from the early 2000s. And it's actually a selection of clips from Chinese films from the 50s and the 60s. So the parts that Zhang Peili had chosen and combined together are parts that the heroes in this film, the last words of them. So the last thing they say, the last thing they have to say before they die. So it's a very funny video if you watch it, because first of all, the performance was very exaggerated. And like people before they die, they would just have this long speech about what they're thinking about, and usually it's about like loving the countries and things like that. And they suddenly die. So it's not very realistic. It's very, expressionless in a way. And it's interesting because it's around this time, the mainstream of the cinema in China was films like this. It's all propaganda films. And in the 50s and the 60s, film production is something that's owned only by the country. So only the state has the resources and has the right to produce film. So no one will make independent film and no commercial film in mainland China. Everything is propaganda. Zhang Peili was born in the 50s. So actually, it's very interesting to imagine people growing up, the generation of Chinese people growing up, watching only films like this. So these are the only films they could watch when they were teenagers and they were youngsters. So no Hollywood, no European, no art cinema, nothing. So this was the only cinema they have. And it's a very funny combination between political propaganda and entertainment. So they remember that they were actually enjoying this film, no matter how fun, no matter how badly made they were, no matter how no matter about the political agenda behind these films. So actually they enjoyed it because it's the only thing they got anyway at that time. So he told me that in about the late 90s, around the time he made this piece, there were a lot of pirate DVDs and VCDs available in mainland China. And suddenly, all of a sudden, so people forgot about this film for a long time already. So in the 80s, people have access to videotapes of Hollywood film, Hong Kong films, and things like that, the commercial entertainment film. They immediately forget about this film. They was dive completely into this wonderful world cinema. And nobody talk about the films anymore. And in the late 90s, he found that in pirate DVDs, he found these films again. So he watched him again, and this funny memory about this propaganda art that they received and the feeling that they had, and to watch it again is how funny it was, how unrealistic it was, and how strangely direct it was. So he decided to make a few films. It's actually one of the few works in the series in which he used clips from films, Chinese films in the 50s and the 60s. This one and the other one is called Happiness, where he just montage and collect clips of people laughing and clapping their hands in this film. And the other one is also very good. This one is especially funny for me because it's like the way the people talk at the time. It's quite ridiculous to see from the point of view of today. And the other interesting thing that he told me is that these films from the 50s and 60s, actually there's no copyright, or the copyright is unknown. The copyright status of these films are unknown because at that time they were made by the country, the state, and this made by this state-owned studio production house around the country. And in the 90s, all these entities, they were closed down. So there were no more of these bureaus in the country. So it's hard to say who owned this film. So when I asked him, do you consider about asking for copyrights and things like that? This is the thing he told me about. No one knows who owns the right of this film.
Thank you. I think.
Yeah.
Sorry. I think that's really interesting and good to know more about the background to this contribution. Maybe we can continue there, and with Chuong-Dai, you've already mentioned Ray Langenbach, and I don't know if everyone understood that he was the filmmaker who documented the performance. That's also part of the film program. Would you like to speak a little bit more about the Joseph Nick performance?
Sure. Yeah, Ray Langenbach, he was the person who documented the performance. He's also a performance artist himself. And he also was an academic. And actually he had spent some time teaching in Finland and in Malaysia until recently. So the Brother Kane video that's available, I want to just contextualize it a little bit. it was a performance that took place at a week-long festival called the Artists General Assembly. And this was a festival that was co-organized by two, at that time, very experimental artist collectives. One was the Artist Village, which was founded in 1988 by Chuong-Dai. And the other one was the Fifth Passage artists. And they were known for really pushing experimental work that questioned gender and identity. So the Artists General Assembly happened within a larger social and political context that was happening in Singapore at that time. The police had been systematically cracking down on establishments that were known to be frequented by gay men, right? And one of the incidents that happened was the police disguised themselves as men, who were socializing at this particular bar, and they entrapped a dozen men and arrested them. And they charged them. 6 of those men pled guilty, and they were sentenced to 2 to 6 months in jail and also public canings. So they received 3 lashes each. And this happened in September 1993, so 2 months before the Artists General Assembly happened. That festival happened from December 26th to January 1st. And so the 2 collectives organized several artistic components to this. Ray himself curated a video component, and part of that was videos that the censors deemed were too provocative because they had some homosexual content, including Marlon Riggs' Tongues Untied. And so what Ray did was he, instead of screening those films, he had text that said that these films were not allowed to be screened. And then there was another component that was curated by Leewen, and that component included this performance by Joseph Ng. So if you've seen the video, you'll know that his performance is a quote unquote recreation of the caning. Right? So what he does is he lays out 12 pieces of wood that have the newspaper article about these men being persecuted or prosecuted. And then on top of those small pieces of wood, he laid out a piece of tofu on each of them. And then beside the pieces of tofu, there are red bags of there are plastic bags of red liquid. And then what he does is, he paces and dances back and forth on the stage, and he canes each of those pieces of tofu and blood, right? And then after he finishes that part, he goes to the back of the stage and he turns his back to the audience, and he lowers his briefs, and he does something that seems to look like he's cutting something, right? Because he's holding a pair of scissors, and we don't know exactly what he does, but he's moving a pair of scissors. And then he puts the pair of scissors down, and he turns around, and he goes back to the other end of the stage, and he puts a small bundle of hair, right? So what happened was that there were a few media people in the audience, and shortly after the festival, there were these sensational headlines, and one of them was something to the extent of, it said pubic protest, but the L public protest, and so the L is in parentheses. Right? So this article was published on January 3rd, 2 days after the festival. And then the next day, the National Arts Council releases a public statement condemning the performance as vulgar, okay, and debased. And I want to just also bring in that, it wasn't just Joseph Ng's performance that was condemned. Shannon Tam, her performance was also condemned. And then Vincent Lo also did a performance in which he drank his urine, and that was also seen as vulgar. Right. And so these performances and Ray Langenbach's video program, were all seen as unacceptable. So shortly after the National Arts Council releases the statement saying Joseph Ng's performance is vulgar, the Singapore police charge Ng for a quote, obscene act, unquote. Right? So he's brought before the court in May of 1994. And it was his intention to not plead guilty, but then the judge called him into chambers and advised him to plead guilty because at that time he was doing military service. And so the judge advised him that, given the circumstances, not only would he be brought before a civilian court, but also before a military court. Right. And so Ng pled guilty. He was fined 1,000 Singapore dollars. Right. So there's that, the larger repercussions of all of this is that, the Fifth Passage artists, they had to shut down their gallery. Ng, even up to today, is not allowed to do performance art in Singapore. And then in terms of the larger community, there was a de facto ban on state funding of performance art. So it was never official, but there were a lot of restrictions put on artists who applied for funding. So things like they had to submit a script. And if they deviated from that script in any way, then they could lose their funding. Another condition was if they got funding, they had to put down 10,000 Singapore dollar as a deposit. Right? And so there were these mechanisms that were built into the system that dissuaded artists from doing performance art. Now that didn't actually prevent them from doing performance art, but they couldn't do it officially. Right? And so they would do it, they would do performance art, but not call it performance art, or they didn't do publicity, they didn't announce it. A lot of times it was just word of mouth. So there were these ways in which it happened, but definitely, it dampened the possibilities. And it really, of course, affected their ability to do experimental works, and for a larger public. And that didn't end until funding didn't really resume until 2004. Yeah, and even now, it's still a very controversial event.
Thank you, Chuong-Dai. I think there are a lot of artists that have made a reference to this event or to this performance in Singapore. And at least I have first heard about this performance through artists from Singapore. Ho Sun Yen, for example, I think included it into a TV work that he did, which is also in the AAA's archive I saw.
Yes.
And then there's a reenactment by Lu Zihan, and so on. So it still has an impact until today, or it's still being discussed.
Yes, I mean, definitely. And there is still, a culture of censorship in Singapore. Yeah, and so that definitely was a big lesson that, the state created. Right? And definitely, that has affected how the arts have been able to develop in Singapore. Yeah, but at the same time, I think that we're really fortunate to have that documentation in the Ray Langenbach archive. Without it, we would not be able to see it now.
Yeah. Should we then move on to the last piece that you selected for the film program, to object activities? I don't know who of you would like to speak about that.
Yeah, sure. I can talk about it. So yeah, so I think that this piece, object activities, which in some ways it continues some of the touches on some of the themes and questions that Anthony and Chuong-Dai raised. On the one hand, it's based on documentation of a performance, an event that actually took place in real time. In this case, a 3-day festival that took place in July of 1989. But on the other hand, it also kind of functions as an autonomous work in some ways because, of the particular editing and the kind of the post-production that went into the video. It would be very difficult to consider it just a kind of a straightforward document of an event. It's highly edited and it's very much transformed and gives a very different impression. There's even a soundtrack, right, which is separate from the kind of the diegetic music that you hear from the sound of the festival itself that took place. Would actually not very far from where I am now. So I think down the hill from me was the building where the events took place. And so in that sense, it has this kind of ambiguous place as document or as artwork. I think, and that's true of a lot of the kind of video-based work that is in Asia Art Archive's collection. It simultaneously is kind of a record of something that happened, but also can function in and of itself as something. And I think these lines get very blurred in the case of performance. I think a lot of artists who do performance start out from a position where they stress the kind of the uniqueness of the performance as a kind of a live action, something that takes place in a particular place at a particular time. But, given that performance is a particularly ephemeral medium, in other words, you can't just kind of, once it's done, it's done, and it doesn't, it's not necessarily available anymore. It's also very, very vulnerable to disappearance and to forgetting. And so in some ways, the document or the record of the performance comes to stand in for the performance. And I think more and more artists see the kind of the importance of that and the necessity of kind of, thinking about that as part of the process of doing a performance itself, right? In the case of Zhang Pei Li, it kind of, it substitutes for the performance, and that's kind of how he became interested in video was, he didn't actually want to be washing a chicken, for instance, in front of an audience. So he did it in front of a video camera, and then that, that became the work. So there's a kind of a surrogate role. Or in the case of actors' lines or, last words, I think, what we have is basically something which was reflecting on medium, the medium specificity of video, thinking about the medium specificity of film. So, there's something there. In the case of object activities, what's interesting is that, it's a piece that stems out of a festival. So in this case, something that had begun to be planned in the spring of 1989 by Choi Yan-ji, who is the kind of the main artist, but also working with a few other artists to kind of think about the kind of the creation of it. And what they did was, they put together a series of different installations and dance and music, different kinds of things that and readings that would take place over the course of the 3 days of the festival. But then what you see in the video is not just kind of, clips or snippets of those performances and the installations as they were found inside the building in Shenzhen, not far from here, but also, this kind of overlayering of something else. And I think that, that something else is maybe what happened in between the initial planning in the spring as opposed to, and the time that it actually took place in July, which is of course the events of June 4th, which took place in Beijing, in Tiananmen Square in particular, and the kind of the, protests, the democracy movements that took place, but then the kind of the massacre that took place as well, right? And it's important to note that, people in Hong Kong, even though, we're actually a few hours by plane from Beijing and, nominally we're still a separate kind of, separate from mainland China, but connected. At the same time, people were very much at that moment in the 80s aware of the connections because, by then it was made clear that, Hong Kong would be kind of going back you know, in 1997. So there was this kind of looking forward to the 90s moment when the handover would happen, right? But then also kind of a discovery and excitement about what China was like, because, you know, Hong Kong was very much part of the kind of the introduction of westernization and market forces. And hopefully at that point, I think there was a lot of hope for democratization and kind of the idea that, you know, China would kind of be joining the rest of the world, right? And so Yanxi, who was one of the organizers for object activities, in fact, was someone who spent a lot of time in mainland China, and so was, you know, very much keeping abreast of these events. And so what happened in June, I think, was very much a shock, right, for people in Hong Kong. You know, I should point out that there was, you know, a demonstration earlier in the year where over 1 million people, you know, supporting the democratic movement and kind of uprising in China had come out in full force. And so, you know, when this was violently suppressed, that created a kind of a sense of doom or kind of anxiety about what that, you know, what Hong Kong's connection to China would actually mean, right? And it was never exactly, you know, spelled out in a very kind of, you know, instrumental or kind of blunt way. But there very much clearly was a sense of existential angst. And you can see this in, you know, particularly in the performance featuring this person who's kind of completely wrapped up like a mummy, right? Or so that it, you know, you could tell it's a person, but it looks like it's a worm or something, you know, who basically doesn't have any autonomy and is basically led around by a kind of a rope or something. And at one moment you see is tied up to basically attached to the wall. And so there's a sense in, you know, that kind of anxiety or that sense of doom, you know, was present. And then added into the video is, you know, superimposed on the kind of the video is imagery of this figure, you know, at various moments. And especially, you know, with this kind of very somber soundtrack that is basically this minimalist like beat, like you know, that kind of layers really kind of the sense of, you know, something not good about to happen, right? And so that's always struck me about this video. I find it, you know, like really fascinating as a kind of like a window into how performance was happening in Hong Kong at that time, but also, you know, this kind of consciousness of the medium specificity of video itself, you know, being able to convey or channel something. And that's really interesting. And I should also point out that, you know, something that maybe is underlying what Anthony and Chuong-Dai and I are talking about is that, you know, there isn't necessarily a centuries-long sense of a public sphere in which civil society can engage in open debate and discourse about things. This is very clear in China. This is very clear in Singapore that, you know, there are state controls over what can be said, what will be said. And I think that results for many people, including artists, you know, a kind of a self-awareness about what they can say and how they should say it. So, you know, even if people are critical about society or critical about the state, most of the time that gets said in ways that are very indirect or kind of ways that are maybe masked or veiled, right? And so rather than saying, oh, you know, China is an awful place, you know, in a performance, maybe you do something which is a little more indirect. You know, you make a reference to something that is a symbol of the state or something else. And so I think that, you know, in these videos, which seem like maybe they're very absurd, you know, like why wash a chicken, you know, or why, you know, break a mirror over and over again, or why, you know, like cane pieces of tofu. If you don't know the context, it's just kind of, it feels very absurd. It's like kind of, you know, like these are funny gestures. But I think behind that, there's maybe the possibility of reading other kinds of intent or other kinds of thinking that are involved in there.
I just want to add to John's point that, you know, one of the reasons that performance art developed and became such an important genre in Southeast Asia is because of censorship. You know, in its beginning, performance art wasn't documented, right? It was ephemeral. So instead of having to lay out, or bring all your equipment to do something with performance art, if you had some friends, you could do something impromptu, as a way to provoke a conversation, right? And then there are no traces. It's also was a medium that allowed artists to really experiment, and do something that perhaps they didn't feel comfortable doing, on a form that was more permanent. And so that was very important. And also performance art was a way to build community. Right? If you know that, when you gather that someone will break out and do something, I think over time, then word spreads, and it's also through those interactions that will happen, that community happens. And I think that is very important in terms of providing this space for some form of civil society. And then I also want to get back to an earlier point that John was making about the blurry line between the artwork and the documentation. That's, I think, something I see a lot in the collections that I work with. So, one of the collections that we brought in recently and that we're still working on is the Leewen Archive. He was best known as a performance artist, but he also was a painter. He did drawings. He wrote lyrics. He sang. He played musical instruments, and so he saw himself as very much a multi or interdisciplinary artist. And his foundation was in drawing and painting, and I think that definitely influenced the way that he did performances and his very choreographed documentary. And so one of the projects that I'm thinking about is Journey of a Yellow Man, which he had planned over his lifetime. He planned 15 iterations. And it's in one of the early iterations, Fire, which happened in India, where he went there to do a residency out in the countryside. And so it's this place where contemporary art and performance art is something that's really alien. And he developed an iteration of Journey of a Yellow Man. And you can see in terms of the photography, that he choreographed with his documenter, that it very much is about documenting the performance, for a future audience. And you see his training in painting in that, in the way that he's thinking about color, the way he's thinking about his silhouette, against the landscape, and how they time it, they time it so that it's around when the sun sets. And so you see this brilliance that emanates from his body when he's standing, on this huge tree limb. And so definitely in those kinds of projects, it's not just a document. It is also the artwork itself.
Maybe we can now, or maybe that leads to another question from me, because you said about the building of communities that's taking place through performance art. My feeling is that Asia Art Archive, which is called Asia Art Archive, is not so much focused on different nations in Asia, but really going very much into these particular regions and communities. And that seems to be very much in the foreground of what you're doing. Could you maybe speak a little bit about how you approach a particular context like this, maybe especially in Southeast Asia, but also in other places? How can you document not just an artist's work, but also the context out of which it comes? And what formats do you develop to bring this across?
Well, I can speak to Southeast Asia, but perhaps John can talk about the collections in general. For us, in terms of the research collections that we choose to work on, one of the important criteria is that there's material not only on a particular artist, but that there's also material, on a larger community, right? So, the Ray Langenbach archive, is definitely fulfills that criteria. I mean, it has documentation not only on Singapore, Burma, Thailand, but many artistic communities. The Leewen Archive, right now online, if you look at the collection, about half of the records are Leewen's documentation of the works of his peers. Right? And that is one of the special things about that collection. Oftentimes, and a senior artist, if they have documentation of other artists, it may be the work of their students, for example, right? But I think that with Leewen, what's special about this collection, and it really does speak to his practice, was that he wasn't just someone who developed his own solo practice, but he was also very much committed to building community, as an arts organizer and as the co-founder of Future of Imagination and Rights, with his peers. And over the
Future
years,
of Imagination and Rights are festivals.
Yes. Yeah. What did I say?
No. I just to clarify that there are these festivals.
So over the years, he and of course many performance artists, they would perform at different festivals, not only throughout Southeast Asia, but other parts of Asia and also Europe and other parts of the world. And Leewen documented not only his work at these festivals, but also the work of other artists. And so that's why this particular archive is so rich in terms of giving us a wider window into the development of performance art in Asia.
Yeah, and I think that, following up on that, I think that, some of the collections do indeed focus or come from particular individuals. And so part of the archive does deal with their individual art career and their oeuvre and their practice. But on the other hand, I think, especially in an Asian context, given that there's not necessarily a pre-existing infrastructure for supporting the creation and dissemination of artwork, a lot of times the artist's practice includes the building of contexts for the viewing and experiencing of artwork. So in other words, artists are not only artists, but artists are curators, artists are critics, artists are historians. They do all kinds of, they play lots of different roles in the ecosystems of Asia. And so, some of that is on view in Leewen, where he, you see his career, you see his sketchbooks, but you also see him as, like an organizer of festivals, and then other artists as organizers of festivals that then he participates in, and I think that becomes a very valuable mechanism, especially because, the state, either because it is actively hostile to the idea of performance, for instance, is the case in Singapore, or just simply doesn't have the means for supporting it. And so, there are other kind of other autonomous or individual independent measures that come in to support that. And I think that, when you were asking about, why is it that festivals are something and exhibitions are something that we're interested in, I think, AAA itself was founded as an independent organization. So it's not allied with Hong Kong government per se, or the Chinese government per se. And I think that kind of has made it I think in a way more in tune with a lot of how contemporary art has developed within Asia, which is outside these kind of official organizations and official kind of institutions. And for that reason, I think it has meant that, at least with some artists, it has been able to build these relationships of trust that, have allowed us to work with them. I think that's been a very important factor. I mean, I think Anthony can speak about the kind of the context in China where, government, artists are not about to, artists who've devoted their entire careers to basically making work that's independent or avant-garde are not about to hand things over to a government that, they were kind of very much conscious was not supporting them,
That's right, John. So self-organization has always been a very important concept in Chinese art. So we can say the entirety of the 80s and 90s, most of the important activities and actions were self-organized in the sense that it was not supported by, say, for example, public funding. And in a lot of cases, it's even illegal. So it's actually, what I mean is, like Chuong-Dai and John has said, the artists have formed their own communities. A lot of things were done by themselves. Independent curators played a very important role in these situations. So, for example, one of the archives that we are currently developing is the archive of an art critic called Tain. And he was considered to be one of the most important art critics and curators in mainland China because he was first a magazine editor. And magazine was very important in the 1980s because it was almost the most important platform for people to publicize their works. That's why Mr. Lee has developed himself as almost like a center of information. So people from all around the country would send information, materials, books, writings, slides to him. And so he literally developed an archive of networks and communities from all around China. So in the histories of the last 40 years, there were individuals like this. And they become the center of a group of people. Either they're magazine editors or they're curators. So that's why it's very important for us to build, collect, and preserve archives of these individuals. I'm sure it's the same in Southeast Asia. Sometimes happens as an institution, like the case of Green Papaya. There was no similar independent organization of art spaces like Green Papaya in mainland China. It was more like individuals, people who work together. So to respond to your question about archiving the context, the community, which is a very important point, I think we can do it by that. Just looking at the archives of certain people like Mr. Lee or Hans van Dyck or Fei Dai, you will see a group of people who have worked together in 10, 20 years. We can see their concerns, we can see their standpoints, and we can see facts about the things that they've done in these archives.
Yeah, I would definitely say that you can't understand contemporary art in Southeast Asia if you don't do research about the collectives. Right? I mean, of course, there are lots of artists, with solo practices and who are very well known for their practices, but a lot of them were nurtured through the infrastructure that was created by collectives of artists. Definitely that's true in Manila, where there are really strong collections of modern art, that because during the Marcos era, the Marcos patronized modern art as a way of nation building, and they also encouraged their fellow rich patrons to do the same. And so the state institutions have very strong modern art collections, but there wasn't really an infrastructure that supported contemporary art. And so we see material in the Roberto Chabot archive, the Green Papaya Manila, Green Papaya Art Projects archive that's going to be available soon. And also another archive, Manila Artist Run Spaces, which has material from 6 artists run spaces that were active from the mid-90s to the early 2000s. All of those archives show us that artists, in assessing the landscape, they realized that they had to take it upon themselves and create their own spaces and support their friends, and make these spaces available so that their communities could gather, and so that they could have a place to do experimental work. You also see that in Vietnam and Indonesia. So yeah, collectives are definitely really important for building contemporary art there.
I think the German audience will learn more about this with Juan Grupa curating the next documenta. That brings me to a last aspect that I would like to mention. I mean, first of all, AAA has an amazing website. And I think whenever you research in the Asian region, then at some point you will end up on your website. But at the same time, you also do all kinds of public programs. And I find this really inspiring also for institutions here in Europe that are now thinking about how to deal with their collections, how to decolonize them, but also how to make them more public and accessible. And if you could speak a little bit about all these different types of programs that you developed and that you kind of use as outreach tools to different communities. And also maybe if you could speak a little bit about who your main audiences are, I mean, besides the huge international web community. I don't know which one of you would like to start.
Well, perhaps I can talk about our learning and participation component, and I think Anthony can talk about exhibitions. You know, one of the archival collections I've been working on is the Leewen Archive, as I mentioned earlier. And you know, one of the ways that we activate our collections is we do what's called teaching lab, you know, where we have a public talk where we introduce the material, and then it's also an opportunity for us to talk about a particular topic. And then there's another component where we work with teachers. And so that component, my colleagues in learning and participation, they work with teachers in Hong Kong and also invite a guest artist to do a workshop with the teachers. Recently, because of Zoom, well, we were going to do a teaching lab with NTU-CCA in Singapore, the Center for Contemporary Art in Singapore. And we were going to do it on location in Singapore, but because of the pandemic, we ended up doing it over Zoom. And I just did the talk a few days ago where we worked with teachers in Singapore and in Hong Kong. But for that public talk, I talked about performance art in Singapore. And I used a particular group of material from the Leewen Archive to do that. Yeah, and that's something that other researchers have done, including Anthony with collections in China, and our colleague Sneha Raghavan has done that in terms of talking about art in India. Anthony, do you want to talk about the exhibition you're working on?
Sure, yeah. So it's actually very important for us to, apart from collecting and preserving the archives, annotating them, etc., to really sort of activate the archive and to find a way to make the archives more accessible and engaging. So teaching lab that Chuong-Dai mentioned is one of them. So we have a program team with colleagues who are, we are researchers here, so we're responsible for collecting the materials and annotating materials. We have a program team who help us to really look at these materials and find a way to make them accessible to different levels of people. Of course, the one major group of audience that we have are people who are from the academia and people from the museum curators and independent curators, so the professionals in the art field. But we also have lots of people who are just like interested parties of art, like students or teachers or general public, etc. That's why we do different types of programs like exhibition. We have a library space in Hong Kong. It's not very big, but we try to do exhibition from time to time. Exhibitions that are relevant to our projects. So Ariane, you have seen the one that is about Leewen that Chuong-Dai has curated. Wonderful exhibition. And the current one, the next one that we have as I'll be responsible for that. And it is about the relationships between 3 generations of artists who are from the China Art Academy in Hangzhou. So it's the exhibition about pedagogy. It's an exhibition about art education in China. And the title of it is Learning What Can't Be Taught. So the basic idea of the project is that it's the paradox about art education. So people talk about whether or not art can be taught and whether or not art can be learned. And we have this wonderful group of people who formed an entity called the New Media Art Department in China Art Academy in Hangzhou from the year 2003-2010. And we think that they are a pioneer in contemporary art education in China in the 2000s. So we look at cases like that to really dip into this question about individual efforts in institutional setting of Chinese art education. And we want to make the archives in a vivid way by curating, but putting them together with original artworks and also a kind of setting that will allow people to read these materials in a different way. So this is one of the things. The other thing is we also have artists in residence. And I always love this because artists always have very interesting and unexpected ways of reading their archives. So we collaborate with artists from time to time. We invite them to make works and projects based on their experience seeing the archive. I'm sorry, there's something wrong with my mic, probably.
No, it's fine.
Okay. Maybe John has something to add about the program.
Yeah. So I think that, as Anthony was saying, we have different levels of audiences. So, they can range from the kind of specialized world of academics and researchers to, primary and secondary school students, as Chuong-Dai was talking about with the learning and participation, and also with the teachers of these primary, secondary, and college-age students. But also, I think, we work with professionals, arts professionals, and so forth. I think that a lot of this has to do with, the very specific kind of collecting that Asia Archive does. So we don't specialize in the collecting of artwork per se. So we're not a museum. We don't collect, works that then get put out into an exhibition. That's not our primary function. And because of what we collect is more archivally based, I think that the kinds of stories, the kinds of things that we do are more adapted to programs that can kind of talk about, or where the question of context and the communities and the circumstances in which art happens and takes place becomes of primary interest. So I think this is why, performance is something which is particularly suited to the archive, because performance lives in some ways, lives on in the archive. Even if it lives in the, in the real world, its afterlife, its history is something that kind of continues in the minds of the viewers, but also in the documents that are made of the performance, right? And what souvenirs there are of it. But at the same time, the archive is a place where you can also find traces of other kinds of events, like exhibitions, like festivals. And all of that, is very well suited for kind of putting away in files, and then kind of, in some ways that it has a kind of a continued survival in that form. And so beyond, kind of teaching and beyond exhibitions and other kinds of live programs, we also do publications. So as Anthony mentioned, very early in Asia Art Archive's career, it embarked on a number of specialized, specific publications that were devoted to archives and projects that it deemed were particularly interesting and worth spreading the word about. But then more recently, we've been engaging in other kinds of publication activities. And so now we're a partner with After All on exhibition histories. And so that's something that I think, we're thinking about how to kind of connect our own interest in the history of exhibitions within an Asian perspective, within a larger kind of field of exhibition studies, which, is actually something which is not particularly old as a kind of a subfield or maybe even distinct field of material studies or visual studies or art history or whatever you want to call it. But, I think there's a kind of a global kind of conversation about that now. So I think, we are partaking of that. And then, we also organize conferences that, not only help us kind of get the word out about what's in our collections, but also help us kind of understand what the needs of scholars are. So, the Bahasa program that, you mentioned earlier is something where we brought 20 younger scholars to Hong Kong before they went to Dhaka for the art summit there, and we had these kind of intense 10-day conversation about the history of modern art in and across Southeast Asia, South Asia, and Africa. And that helped us understand, what are things, what are topic subjects that, these younger scholars are studying, what are they thinking about, what are the issues that are of interest to them. And that helps us kind of stay in touch with, I think, intellectuals' information, and, helps us kind of stay young as an organization and kind of thinking about, okay, what are future fields that we could be thinking about? What are things that, we could be in dialogue with? And so, it's not just kind of a way of getting the archive out there, but it's also letting the out there of the public into what we do and kind of, provide feedback. And it's a kind of a cyclical process. Mute.
My last question would then be, picking up on this, where do you see the future of Asia Art Archive? I mean, if you could foresee it. And as a side question, maybe do the political changes in Hong Kong, China, do you think that will affect what you're doing in any way? Or maybe just kind of re-inform that what you're doing is that you're on the right track, let's say.
Well, I think that, the current kind of situation in Hong Kong may be something which, all organizations in Hong Kong and outside Hong Kong, I think, are very much aware of. I think, these tensions that exist in the political sphere are affecting a lot of organizations and institutions, not just here in Hong Kong. And so I think that, a lot of people are going to need to be mindful of them. But if I don't think that that necessarily directly means that we are changing what we're doing. Certainly, I don't think we have any plans to, stop doing something necessarily. But I think it does mean that we just, are more aware of the context in this case and kind of just being attuned to what's happening. I think is something that we have to do. As for the future, I think this is something that we're thinking very much about, given that we are about to hit our 20th birthday next month in December. And so, I think we're at this kind of moment where, of taking stock. So not only is it our 20th anniversary, but also we have just hit 100,000 records in our collection. So that's kind of like, it feels like a very, I actually have to say that, this was something when I started 3 years ago, I was thinking, okay, it'd be great if we can get to 100,000 for our collection, because I think at that point we were, I don't know, we were like at 30 or 40 or somewhere around there. And I didn't think that we would get to 100 so quick. So I'm actually really happy. I'm really happy that, we got there. But I think, in terms of building the collections, that's something that, is obviously going to be an important part of what we do, especially in this moment when people may not necessarily themselves be able to travel. So making resources available online is, I think, going to be very important to what we do. But then also, I think, being part of this larger conversation as the arts ecosystem in Hong Kong. I mean, it's very important to point out when AA was founded in 2000, there were not so many organizations. Like there was the Hong Kong Museum of Art. Parasite was the kind of the main, if not the main kind of independent art space. And there was no other kind of, not so many other arts organizations, institutions. And, now we have Art Basel, we have, M+, which is about to open. There's, Daigun, there's kind of a, there's commercial galleries. And so we're part of this larger conversation now. So I think, thinking about how we can adapt with and help support and build on this ecosystem and this conversation is something I think that we can definitely do. And be here in Hong Kong, but also beyond. So, yeah.
Thank you for this. Thank you all for describing your work so extremely well and in an interesting way. Maybe just as a kind of last, very quick outlook, because we cannot travel so much at the moment. John, could you speak about the crafting community show that's on right now, just very briefly?
Yeah, sure. So crafting communities is an example of one of the exhibitions that Aaa is doing that really builds on the collecting and the collections that we have. So the exhibition focuses on Womanifesto, which is an artist-led initiative that began in 1990. Well, dates to 1995. But really begins 1997 and then was active for about 10 to 12 years. So in Thailand from 1997 to 2008, run by women. So it's called Womanifesto because it was kind of women focused, although not exclusively for women. And so there was a series of biennial events that took place first as a series of exhibitions and then transforming into workshops, residencies, artist publications, and also a website. And so all of that, is something that is covered by the exhibition, but it's also has as an aim kind of complicating the picture of what we think of as feminist art, because, Womanifesto is often thought of within the lens or from the perspective of feminist art in Asia. But not only is it about inclusion and representation of women artists, but it's also thinking about how those ways of thinking change. So, it became less about just simply exhibiting women artists to putting in practice a feminist ethos. And so I think that's where the workshop and the residency that are the focus of the exhibition become really important, because you can see the development of something that almost resembles social practice and social practice sensibilities and what the artists were doing on a farm. In other words, they moved from Bangkok, the urban capital, to kind of a distant kind of, farm that was in the Isan region. So really the provincial rural part of Thailand and outside the kind of art capital, as a way to kind of really recenter what they were doing, the artists were doing, kind of think about ways of including a non-urban, non-metropolitan population in their practice, in their work. And so, that in itself is also a kind of thinking about how feminism itself, evolves and changes from something which is merely about inclusion of women per se to something which, is thinking about community and kind of putting the focus on other things. Yeah, so the exhibition is on through this month. The Womanifesto organizers are actually busy in the process of, even though we're all in lockdown, so they're in lockdown in Thailand, in India, in Australia, and other parts of the world. But the Womanifesto organizers actually are interested in doing something. So I think they're in the process of organizing something which will be launched later this year, where each of them are going to kind of, I think, do something in place, but kind of connect online. So stay tuned for that, I guess.
Thank you.
And
Thank you
also
so
we
much.
have our last panel for that exhibition. Is it November 17th, John?
Yes, yeah. So basically the week after next, we'll have a second panel thinking about precisely these questions of the evolution of feminism and feminist artistic practice in the kind of Southeast Asian, South Asian, Austronesian context. Yeah. You can find out more on our website, aaa.org.hk. So, yeah.
Thank you so much. I just checked the chat and I don't see anything here, strangely. I don't know if it's me or if there are no questions, but I think we've spoken so long. I would say we can stop here, and this will be recorded and uploaded to the Archive außer sich website, and everyone can look at it at a better time than on a Saturday morning or on a Saturday evening for you.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for participating in this. And is there anything else you guys would like to add, or should we just stop here?
No, I think just thank you for having us and taking your morning to speak with us about AAA and the pieces. And hopefully people will be able to watch the programs that we selected, but also that Videotage and Video Bureau. It looks really fascinating. So I'm looking forward to seeing all the work.
Definitely. Everything's online right now, and this talk will also be online extremely soon, I think today, hopefully. Yeah, thank you so much, and let's keep in touch.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Have a good day.
Bye-bye. Thank you all. Bye-bye. Ciao.